When following the rational thought process of science, it leads to cognitive dissonance, higher rate of suicide, which would ideally show that the evolutionary process favors religion. Hume makes an argument that we can't trust this, right? We can't trust our ability to empirically define anything. Do we trust Hume's argument? He invalidates his own argument by his argument.
Yeah.
So anybody who wants to say that we are this random mutation, this collocation of atoms over time, that we can't trust our faculties because they're not from a rational designer, defeats their own argument by saying we can't think rationally.
Yeah.
Well, then why is your explanation to be trusted of the rational thought process of man? Can you see the insanity of that proposition?
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting to me is that so many people subscribe to this ideology. But if you just walk through it logically, you take a few steps into it and you start to realize that this descends into absurdity. Because what you've done again is you've put this on an infinite spectrum. You've essentially said that the human mind is not a rational thought process in a box here. It's an irrational mind that can be anything. Could have come from anywhere and completed by any process. It's random. Well, then it all degrades into chaos. Now, theism is a great counter to that argument, because what does theism posit? Theism posits that we were designed by an intelligent designer who gave us rational cognitive abilities. He was a rational designer. He put a rational mind in us, which means that the uniformity of the world around me is rational. And I would expect, if it were designed by a rational God, that I would find uniform laws of nature in nature. This is what drove Copernicus, Galileo, the early scientific, revolutionists of the Enlightenment period, was that they believed that the uniformity in nature was there because it came from a rational being. If we believe that our mind is irrational and can't be trusted and came through random mutation and natural selection, shouldn't we find the same random natural order in the universe? Richard Dawkins makes the stupidest statement I've ever heard. He says we find in nature what does he say? We find in nature essentially what looks to be design, but it's not really design. It's like, what does that even mean? It looks like design, but it's not design. How does that function? You tell me. Find me something that looks like design that is not design.
Yeah. Interesting enough, there's rational thinking that goes into the idea that you're choosing to be rational with certain parts of your life, but irrational in other parts of your life, right? So i.e., when I put this pen on this paper, that's a rational thought that I believe that it's going to write something.
Yeah.
But I'm going to be irrational about certain other points, like all of this has no meaning, or if I choose to kill somebody, it has no consequence. Or
you are acting rationally, but positing an ideology that is irrational.
That's right.
And so what theism does is it posits a rational ideology that allows your actions to be congruent with your thought process. And this in life is how one wins, is when who they know they should be is aligned with how they act. But when we know something and we don't act what we know, we create this cognitive dissonance, which brings anxiety and all of these other negative emotions because it's entropic in nature. For one to believe something and act counter to that belief either destroys the belief or the act.
Mm-hmm.
One has to win. Those two cannot be competing. And that's why you find people like Friedrich Nietzsche, who said that the death of God would lead to nihilism and destruction, killed himself. Because he had to align his actions with his thought process. And what that ended up was that his actions won. He was congruent with his thought process, credit to him. But if that's the route you want to go, then what's funny to me is this. So science wants to posit that religion is false. But when following the rational thought process of science, it leads to cognitive dissonance, higher rate of suicide, which would ideally show that the evolutionary process favors religion. Because there's empirical data to show that religious people are happier, they live longer, they have more children, which means that their ideology perpetuates ongoing. So it's interesting to me that the scientific argument basically shows that
so counterproductive. Yeah.
To think that way is actually, through natural selection, going to destroy anybody that believes this thought process. And that's what's so funny is as you extrapolate this out into society, you start to realize the insanity of the scientific naturalist thought process. And it's like, why then wouldn't one posit that theism is a better explanation or a better way of operating than scientific materialism? Because to not be able to trust one's faculties and act like it, and then eventually lead to nihilism and destruction and the killing of oneself. I mean, listen, if that's what you want to believe, go for it. But natural selection is going to weed you out. And eventually all that's going to be left is people who are congruent with how they think and act. And the only way to do that is to believe that there is rationality to the universe that came from a rational designer that gave us a rational mind to comprehend the rational aspect of the universe around us, back to the religious axioms that science is based on. So it's based on religious axioms. You can act like you think differently, but your actions of finding and discovering rational truth in the universe are belying what really is the truth of the thought process that needs to be equipped in order to be a good, productive scientist